Welcome to our Gender and Sexuality presentation. Through this presentation and our website, we aim to provide you with an interactive and valuable experience. We will analyze three overarching ideas in our presentation: the historical overview of the rejection and exclusion of gender minorities, which delves into the power imbalances and oppression within the educational domain. We will also demonstrate the importance of fostering students' positive identities to promote validation and self-worth. And we will explore how the curriculum lends itself to the inclusion of gender and sexual minorities by exploring curriculum as plan and curriculum as lived experiences. We offer recommendations for our school systems and provinces to improve in their support and guidance through these delicate and highly relevant topics. During the presentation, there will be activities embedded within. The activities range from reflections to an exercise that must be completed on our website. Instructions will be provided when applicable. We hope that you enjoy. Because this week's topics are especially contentious ones in our society, it is normal for educators to feel a great sense of nervousness when placed with the responsibility of teaching young children about gender and sexuality. Please take a moment to privately reflect on your fears when approaching the topics of gender and sexuality in the classroom. What limits your engagement with these topics? What factors or who influences your hesitation or resistance to engage? Gardner, Dean, and McKeag stated that those who are different become outsiders, whose experiences are devalued and often ignored or erased. When analyzing the history of the women's movement and the oppression of gender and sexual minorities within the education system, one cannot ignore the term validation. Validation is the recognition and the acceptance of another person's experiences as being valid. The goal is not to act alike or be alike. The goal is to be valued alike.
I've talked to nearly 30,000 people on this show, and all 30,000 had one thing in common. They all wanted validation. And if I could reach through this television, sit on your sofa, or sit on a stool in your kitchen right now, I would tell you that every single person you ever will meet shares that common desire. They want to know, do you see me? Do you hear me? Does what I say mean anything to you? Understanding that one principle, that everybody wants to be heard, has allowed me to hold the microphone for you all. It has worked for this platform, and I guarantee you it will work for yours. Try it with your children, with your husband, your wife, your boss, your friends. Validate them. I see you. I hear you. And what you say matters to me.
Beth Young argued that despite women's teaching experiences in Canada during the 19th century, the view persisted that women were not capable of teaching older children or managing schools. The gender imbalance in Canadian society reached a breaking point in the late 1960s. In effort to bring forth awareness of women's inequality and to validate women's worth in society, the women's movement targeted the educational domain as the optimal battleground to attain women's equality. Gaskell explained that the women's movement activists believed that they needed institutional power in order to thrust their privately budding ideas into the public spotlight. This movement brought forth mandated gender awareness to Canadian schools. In the late 1980s, every Canadian province had guidelines for textbook selection designed to eliminate sex biases in learning materials. Women's histories were added to the curricula, and there was an increased pressure to have women in positions of administrative power. Girls were encouraged to seek career counseling to broaden their career choices, particularly in the maths, sciences, and technological domains. Despite these initiatives, girls and boys continued to be regarded in very distinct manners. Despite the indisputable positives that arose from the women's movement, Coulter argued that by adopting a non-sexist approach, teachers were inadvertently reinforcing the notion that girls were inferior. There was the assumption that girls must change, not the system itself. Girls must be helped. Feminist theorists have argued that women's inherent differences are to be valued. Yet, in an effort to achieve equalness, the masculinity norm was left intact, and females were positioned to transcend towards sameness of men. These results that spawned from the women's movement continue to pervade our system today, and they have had dire consequences for both boys and girls. McIntosh argued that one of the greatest societal myths is that males and females are polar opposites. This oppositeness, compounded with the patriarchal belief that males are superior, has restricted males to develop certain attributes that have been projected onto women. Males have a remarkable ability to show compassion and to be plural-minded. However, these attributes are not rewarded. Control, risk-taking, and individualism are rewarded and fully expected of males to maintain the fragility of masculinity. Masculinity and heterosexuality are powerful social constructions with strict boundaries. These boundaries have been carefully policed to maintain their positions of power. Children understand from a young age the importance of getting gender right, to avoid the scrutiny and ridicule that will unfold if they are deemed abnormal by their social network. Keller argued that after more than 30 years of research in gender and education, there is still a resistance to acknowledge gender and all of its complexities as one of the most powerful factors in the educational setting. Another powerful factor, which has often been ignored or disregarded completely, is one's sexual orientation. The terms lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, heterosexual, and homosexual are social constructions that do not date back further than the late 1800s. Labels have been used as the tools to promote societal values. Those in positions of political and economic power spread and encourage the values and practices of the majority at the expense of those in lesser positions of power. Sumara and Davis argued that the creation of identifying terms, such as gay and lesbian or transgendered, has led society to believe that we know precisely what these labeled groups' lives entail, as if we could lump all transgendered persons' experiences into one distinct category. The trouble with this belief, Sumara and Davis found, was that it ignores each person's lived experiences and expressions. Elia argued that the majority's continued hegemony over minorities' experiences has been the quintessential force perpetuating the eraser and marginalization of sexual and gender others. Sexuality, gender normativity, and hegemonic masculinity have been fully expected and strongly enforced throughout our history. In the late 1960s, as the women's movement was blazing its path through the educational domain, the gay movement was gaining in strength and visibility. Although the movements cannot be viewed as one and the same, as the group's histories are terribly complex and fraught with injustice, they did both strive to upend the then current social order. To the majority's chagrin, women, and then homosexuals, were making their way into the public sphere. Freer argued that the oppressors are the ones who act upon men to indoctrinate them and adjust them to a reality which must remain untouched. Our differences incite fear. And although these fearful protests began decades prior, it was not until the late 1980s that the gay community pushed forth with a renewed and radical assertiveness. This momentum forced individual schools and then entire school systems to grapple with the reality that gay and lesbian youth are in the schools and they are not going away. Counts argued that teachers must bridge the gap between school and society and play some part in the fashioning of those great common purposes which should bind the two together. To draw a parallel between the promotion of girls' and women's equality and the recognition of sexual minorities, the binding factor was the educational setting. Society was continuously unwilling to bear its burdens where they should properly be shouldered. Thus, it was passed on to the educators in the hope that they could somehow navigate through these topics which others were unwilling to address. Notting stated, "A society unwilling to talk with its children about love, delight, and commitment asks the schools to teach sex education." Roths passionately stated that one of the saddest aspects of what our culture does to gay and lesbian students is that a period of life that could be filled with the discovery of one's identity in a positive and growth-filled way becomes mired in shame, denial, and self-hatred. Therefore, it is imperative that educators strive to provide an environment that nurtures a child's positive identity.
Nurturing a positive identity is an important part of education, whether it is cultural identity, physical ability, sexual orientation, or gender. Often overlooked in elementary school, sexual or gender minority children's identities are important, and we have a responsibility to nurture each child.
There is a dire need for teachers to analyse their role and level of participation in the continued indoctrination of gender norms and stereotypes.
Oppressed individuals must discover their identity and come to appreciate their existence, not in reference to the dominant culture, but for its own merit.
When a collection of ideas takes hold in the public's imagination, it becomes a convincing reality, rather than being recognised as a socially constructed, extended collection of instances.
We live with the illusion that the sex categories of male and female and the gender categories of men and women are natural, homogeneous, unidimensional. Gender identity, as with any other part of one's identity, is seldom so. Rather, our identities are fluid, messy, and contextual. Girls and boys began to develop stereotypic knowledge about girl toys and boy toys in preschool. The rigidity of these gender stereotypes, what is normal gender behavior, dress, language, and roles, is amplified as children age. Challenging stereotypes can help students become aware of gender binaries as a set of assumptions, rather than seeing them as rigid, unchanging phenomena. Traditional masculine identities see boys as a coherent and undifferentiated category. For example, despite many other strengths, a boy who does not excel in gym class is never seen as quite as masculine. Keller writes that it is crucial to hear, recognize, and support a polyphony of voices among and between men. Similarly, feminine identities are clearly defined. Our image of girls and what we deem normative behavior are continually reinforced. Girls who fall outside of this norm, such as wild, sexual, or mean girls, are demonized. In 1998, the McDonald's argued that sexism permeates all aspects of the school, including its organization, status hierarchy, and curriculum. No aspect of school life seems to escape these influences. How do we create a space for individual identities to emerge, allowing boys to display a wide array of masculinities and girls a similar diversity of gender roles? Our schools need to provide role models of different kinds of men and different kinds of women. What about those who identify as both or don't identify as either? This leads us into the journey of a gender creative or a trans student. Can you imagine never seeing yourself represented in a school? never even hearing a word for who you are or how you feel, having gay parents and never seeing your family in a book, never imagining yourself in an adult role, feeling out of place every day in an institution designed to nurture you? The journey of a sexual or gender minority student is not always easy. Though the numerous stories of resilient sexual or gender minority victors are inspiring and critically important messages to be sent, we cannot forget that so many sexual or gender minority youth are left vulnerable. Many are facing harassment, discrimination, violence, internalized homophobia, and perceived stigmatization, factors that lead to high rates of stress, often at very significant levels. Frankly, recent statistics are staggering, and the risks are paramount. These already at-risk youth then come to school every day and watch as their identity, who they are at their very core, is completely ignored by their peers, their teachers, their curricula. Because of this curricular neglect, they leave school with the understanding that heterosexuality and gender conformity are more accepted, respected, and simply better than other identities. Nichols strongly links the heterosexualized context of schools to the lack of validation of feelings, identities, and behaviors of sexual minority youth. Since schools have been promoting these negative outcomes, they therefore have a responsibility to take a more active role in establishing more affirmative results. As educators, let's use the knowledge that we have about the risks facing sexual and gender minority children to create a place where we can nurture positive identity. Let's hope that this work can expand rather than limit the ways that young people live and imagine gender. This video was made by the mother of one of our elementary school students. She speaks openly about her daughter's need to find a positive identity in her school and to foster an environment of inclusion in our classrooms.
Hello, I'm Sarah King. I'm the proud mom of 3 girls. Had you asked me several years ago to identify myself, I would have said I had a boy and 2 girls. My eldest daughter, who is 9 years old, openly transitioned in kindergarten at the age of 4 or 5. And when I think of the school's responsibility when it comes to gender and in situations like this, I feel strongly it's their responsibility to foster an environment of inclusion. We also need to look at curriculum and we need to look at language. So for example, when it comes to teams and breaking up children into teams, often gender is used. And really that sets this very binary view of gender, and that, tells children they're either a boy or a girl. And really for children like my daughter, this presents sort of a very strict view of the world, which may or may not match how she views herself. And then when we look at curriculum, I keep thinking back to the day where we finally found a children's book that reflected my daughter's experience and how, what a dramatic event that was. My daughter, who showed little interest in reading prior to this, suddenly had a book that reflected who she was and her experiences. And it was amazing. I mean, she woke up early the following morning to read it several times before school. She asked to bring it to school to show her teachers. And it really struck home that in all the books she reads at school and most of what she is witness to really doesn't tell her story or reflect her experiences. So I feel strongly that curriculum needs to be looked at right down to the books that are available in the classroom to ensure that there's a variety of experiences being shown. And I think that's so important for her view of herself, her place in the world, and how she interacts with her peers. There's very few resources for transgendered children who are young, and I think we often think that, as children are quite, young, they're still developing, they may not have a sense of themselves, and I come across this quite a bit, and I feel again strongly that we need to acknowledge that, a sense of gender and gender identity is something that small children have as well. We need to respect that. Thank you.
Take a moment to reflect on how you're feeling now. Pause this video and open the Interactivities tab on the website. Complete the chalkboard exercise where you can share some stereotypes that you see in the classroom and around the school. We want to stress that this is a safe space to share your thoughts without judgment.
As we have seen, heterosexuality, gender normativity, and patriarchal power have been fully expected and strongly enforced throughout our history. This continued hegemonic presence has been the quintessential force perpetuating the deletion and marginalization of sexual and gender others. Subsequently, our schools have been promoting and reproducing this hegemony by continuing the silence, refusing to acknowledge the existence of sexual gender minority youth and the power of women. For years, society has been manipulating schools. Now is the time for schools to contest. What the future leaders of our world all have in common is that they are all, right now, situated inside our classrooms. Therefore, our schools are in a strategic position to shift the power in the equation and become the influential force over society. If we give our students the essential knowledge, if we give them the resources, and if we give them the chance, they have the potential to be our most hopeful means of correcting the destructive forces of previous generations' prejudices. The most critical tool to drive this social change is empowerment of our youth. Our schools have for so long been hindering this empowerment by diminishing students' feelings of validation, teaching them to blindly follow arbitrary parameters, and not challenging the status quo. I argue that the implementation of sexual and gender minority topics into our schools is crucial to developing the empowerment our children need to change this hegemonic nature of our world. We've seen the problems of not including sexual and gender minority topics in our schools. What are the solutions? The Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network suggests that what is needed is inclusive curriculum, families acceptance, school and peer support, school-based policies, and educated educators. Please note that on our website, we created some lesson plans that directly correlate to each of these factors. Our children are still being raised with such limited ideas of appropriate gender behavior and acceptable relationships, and these learned judgments are deeply ingrained by the age of 5. Our children begin life as blank slates and then learn about the parameters they're supposed to live within through media, songs, and stories. A good first step, then, is for children to be introduced to books that assist them in developing a different paradigm while their minds are still open. Sexual and gender minority themed stories can offer a window into the world of a sexual and gender minority youth and provide mirrors in which sexual and gender minority children can see themselves. As Overby and Barth note, research has found that increased contact with sexual and gender minority individuals and positive exposure, reinforcement, and representation of these people through literature and media can help alleviate negative attitudes. However, simply reading a book with sexual and gender minority characters does not completely guarantee that the students will gain a sensitivity or understanding of sexual and gender minority people. To really combat heteronormativity, reading of these books must be extended into in-depth conversations so that children can challenge what has been indoctrinated and develop their own truth. Not only do sexual and gender minority and women's studies topics align with our social studies curriculum, we are actually not coming close to meeting the full purpose of social studies as a subject when we are entirely disregarding groups of people and disregarding mistreatment of groups of people. Alberta Education notes that this program emphasizes the importance of diversity and respect for differences and promotes a sense of belonging in students. This mandate is not being realized when we refuse to fully celebrate diversity or create an atmosphere of acceptance for all. Exploring lessons about injustice, inequality, and rights and freedoms can go a long way towards creating citizens who validate and accept differences. Further, as Maguth and Taylor note, social studies textbooks and resources make invisible the long history of prejudice and discrimination faced by sexual and gender minorities and women. We are not presenting an accurate history. Including sexual and gender minority and women historical figures in our social studies lessons will begin to make visible the people, past and present, who traditionally have not been seen. As Rands notes, what and how we teach math is influenced by social factors and does have hidden messages that often reinforce oppression. By incorporating representation of women and queer people into our math curriculum, we are more fully equipped to challenge this. Including women and gay individuals in word problems, incorporating sexual and gender minority symbols in geometry, engaging students in critical analysis of statistics that reveal sexism and heterosexism, and examining timelines of significant moments in sexual and gender minority history are highly engaging examples. Isolating these topics into certain subject areas still contributes to the abnormality of it. Integrating it into other areas goes a long way in demonstrating the normalcy of these identities. It is very common for struggling sexual and gender minority youth to feel helpless and hopeless. To assist in fostering resilience in these children, it is critical to share with them stories of others who have come through it all and emerged on top. Our children need to be exposed to stories of sexual and gender minority victors who turned a potentially negative situation into a positive one for themselves or for many. By exploring gay activists who used their plight to make a change, or female pioneers who made a difference, or simply sexual and gender minorities who've led a positive existence, we can show our youth that it will, in fact, get better. The preceding examples demonstrate where sexual and gender minority topics should be present in the curriculum. They should not just be haphazardly mentioned in health classes, where they're taught as abstract clinical information. The placement of these topics exclusively in sexual education has been further contributing to the problem. Labeling it all as sex has been keeping it out of our schools. Some queer theorists like Sumara and Davis argue that curriculum theory should focus on experiences of desire, of pleasure, and of sexuality. We're not entirely sure we agree. Sears argues that teaching queerly is not teaching about sex. It embodies educators who model honesty, civility, authenticity, integrity, fairness, and respect. It is about creating classrooms that challenge categorical thinking, promote interpersonal intelligence, and foster critical consciousness. This is not about sex. It's about equality, respect, and justice for all. Meet Ella, a teenage transgender friend of ours who only learned about transgender when she stumbled upon the concept on a website. Looking back, she wishes that she'd learned about these concepts earlier in life and knows that this would have made a difference in her journey.
Well, just when you're little, health class is more like the family dynamic, like what's marriage, where do babies come from, what does a mom do, what does a dad do, and like in like the illustrations it was always like mom cleaning and like just really stereotypical. I just wish they'd have kind of included other possibilities and explained them a little bit as much as they did, you know, the cishet stereotype.
Knowing all this at a younger age, would that have helped your transitioning?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would have just transitioned a lot younger, and that would have made things a lot easier for me. If you're in the know, then you don't, at least for me, I wouldn't have really doubted myself. I would have been afraid to be who I was. And I just would have made things a lot easier.
The curriculum as planned is what typically garners the most attention, as it is tangible and explicit, out there for all to see. But equally impactful, as Aoki notes, is the curriculum as lived experience, where the environment ceases to be environment, and in its place comes into being a pedagogic situation, a lived situation, pregnantly alive in the presence of people.
The topics of cultural diversity, Indigenous perspectives, and gender and sexuality focus on the idea of privilege. Educators, from the dominant majority, approach educational issues from a privileged position. We can absent-mindedly make comments and choose materials that coincide with our beliefs and our sense of normal. Take a moment to privately reflect how an educator with straight privilege could influence his or her teaching methods and materials to favor his or her sense of normalcy. As a result of these choices, what what message would this send to students?
As Thornton notes, the hidden curriculum of schools rigidly patrols the boundaries of sexual behavior. Although unmentioned in the publicly announced curriculum, all young people learn that sexual deviance, actual or perceived, exacts a heavy price. It is surely one of the most successful exercises in social training that schools perform. Part of this is the blatant use of homophobic words and phrases such as "that's so gay," but potentially even more damaging are the subtleties that underlie everything in a classroom. To begin, our textbooks and classroom books are brimming with the suggestion that heterosexuality is more respected and accepted. Further, the assumptions that we make every day further reifies the heteronormative. This happens every time we assume that a child has opposite-sex parents or that they will one day go on to themselves have a nuclear family. This happens every time we assume that a child will have certain likes or dislikes or be interested in a particular career. All of this continues to imply that heterosexuality is normal, other identities are not, and the abnormality of these other identities is reinforced. As well, the everyday words that we continually choose to use contain examples of misogynistic language. The sexism and patriarchy in words and phrases like policeman or you guys keep defining and reinforcing these gender distinctions and the distribution of power. Teaching students the detrimental impacts of using this derogatory language is crucial, as is ensuring that teachers are a living, breathing example of this. Please refer to the PRISM link on our website that has an incredible lesson called Crabby Language that can help teach the children the detrimental impacts of these words. It's important to note that not only do these topics fit in directly with our existing curriculum, but now all Canadian provinces and territories have provincial legislation, ministerial directives, and policies to protect the rights of sexual and gender minorities. We are legally mandated to enable students with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions to have full, safe, and equitable participation in curricular and extracurricular activities. Please refer to our website where we have a list of the provincial mandates across our country to find out where yours fits. For many sexual and gender minority youth, the feelings of isolation and invalidation do not stop at the schools. Unfortunately, the home can be a place where children can be subject to intolerance or even harassment. The rejection of a sexual or gender minority youth by their family has detrimental implications on their physical and mental health. Experiencing rejection because of who they are leave these children with lower self-esteem and fewer people to turn to. As they get older, this leads to higher rates of drug use, risky sexual behavior, and an inability to plan for the future. Most devastating, these youth are statistically far more likely to attempt suicide than their peers, who were supported by their families. Engaging family in the discussion and educating them about the consequences of rejecting their child is therefore paramount to ensuring the mental and physical well-being of sexual and gender minority children. In this manner, schools need to be doing far more. Schools are the liaison between a child and their parent and between a parent and the community. Parents look to us as experts on child development. We need to be better equipped to help mediate a parent's acceptance of their child. We may be the first in line of support and can help make vast improvements in the lives of these children. It is also critical that the family acceptance piece of the solution includes promotion of acceptance of sexual and gender minority families. Children from sexual and gender minority families are subjected to mistreatment and harassment from peers, with a substantial amount feeling unsafe in the school setting. These children also watch their parents' identities being completely disregarded in the school setting. This invalidation of a child's family structure can have lasting negative repercussions in regards to development of positive self-concept. It is apparent, then, to ensure we meet the goal of offering students welcoming, caring, respectful, and safe learning environments that respect diversity and nurture a sense of belonging and a positive sense of self, we need to promote acceptance of all families. One of the major consequences of homophobic and transphobic bullying, as well as of strictly heteronormative climates, is that students end up feeling isolated from the rest of their community. It is essential for the healthy development of all youth that they have a chance to connect and to feel a part of something. Schools that can provide an open and inclusive culture, providing student connectedness, can act as an important buffer for at-risk behavioral patterns of sexual minority youth. One of the best ways to foster this connectedness and sense of identity is through the creation of GSAs. GSAs, or gay straight alliances, are one of the most powerful tools used to transform schools into safer and more welcoming spaces for sexual and gender minorities. They are a place where youth can seek the imperative acceptance and social support. Research has shown that sexual and gender minority youth in schools with GSAs heard fewer homophobic remarks, experienced less victimization, and missed significantly less school due to concerns for their safety. It's further noted that the young adults who participated in high school GSAs report significantly lower rates of depression and higher rates of educational attainment and self-esteem. By providing youth with opportunities to engage in school communities and develop friendships, GSA groups seem to improve youth's connection to their peers in their schools, thus influencing their self-worth and feelings of hope, consequently having an impact on their academic achievement and overall health and well-being. The tremendous safeguard that GSAs are providing suggests that we should be questioning why all schools don't have them, rather than questioning why some schools do. Our sexual and gender minority youth are at a substantially heightened risk for lower grades, low self-esteem, missed school, substance abuse, and most frighteningly, suicide. This is consistently due to these students feeling unsafe from being frequent targets of harassment, discrimination, and violence. These are all too common occurrences in our schools, and all too often these crimes perpetuated against these youth are being swept under the rug. As Thornton notes, what is clear is that administrators and teachers are not being neutral or impartial when they ignore this. Silence, far from neutral, implicitly condones continuation of the persecution. Due to the critical consequences of these exploits, acts of transphobia and homophobia need to be treated as the hate crimes they are, and consequences need to be predictable and severe. Many educators and admin will argue that their generic bullying policies are in place and are valuable measures to help these youth. This is an erroneous assumption. Sexual and gender minority specific policies must be in place in order to fully mitigate the risks. When such policies are in place, sexual and gender minority students feel safer at school and are less likely to be bullied. Our schools have an ethical and legal obligation to promote the healthy development of all students. These policies can go a long way towards providing this. Sexual and gender minority inclusion is critical toward interrupting heteronormativity and giving sexual and gender minority students a voice and a sense of belonging. At the same time, we must recognize that inclusion is ultimately not enough. It's the quality of inclusion that matters. As Thornton notes, even concerned and willing educators face some significant obstacles to incorporating this material in their curriculum. We need to be aware that many educators, though mostly well-intentioned, just do not have the necessary background knowledge and skills to do this topic justice. Other teachers have their own biases or misconceptions that must be remedied before they can effectively create a safe environment. Many school employees simply are not ready to handle the challenges that confront them when faced with these topics. Educators, administration, and other school faculty must be trained and informed so they can be best equipped to serve sexual and gender minority youth. Proper training will provide them with more confidence to deliver the content and will ensure that the appropriate knowledge and attitudes are bestowed upon our children. As Goodenow notes, it is also imperative that not only are knowledgeable professionals present in the school, but also that sexual minority students believe that those staff members are accessible and willing to help them. Meet Ainsley, a 7th grade friend of ours who is bisexual. She has developed a positive identity, has developed a critical consciousness, and is well on her way to effect social change.
It is harmful to promote heteronormative and cis-sexist ideas in schools. A lot of kids are teased and bullied for being gay or transgender. This is because children are taught that people can only be straight and cisgender. Kids are bullied because they're different or weird. If we teach kids that it's abnormal to be anything but straight and cisgender, children who aren't will be teased. We need to see being queer or trans as uncommon, not odd. I mean, there are approximately the same number of left-handed people as there are gay people. We don't bully left-handed people for being left-handed, so why should we bully gay people for being gay? That's pretty much all I have to say. Thanks for watching.
Given the historical context of sexual and gender minority people, we are tasked with nurturing positive identities, working with youth to promote social progress, and making real changes with regards to both the curriculum as planned and curriculum as lived experience. Integration of sexual and gender minority topics in our schools can no longer be up for debate. Bringing these topics to light can and will mobilize social change. This inclusive teaching will provide sexual and gender minority youth and children of sexual and gender minority parents the validation and positive identity necessary to inspire change, and will equip all children with the critical consciousness and motivation for social action that will lead to change. Those who have lived by the notion that children should be seen and not heard have missed out on utilizing one of our most valuable change agents. Our world has a long tradition of youth taking leadership in social movements and fighting for democracy and justice, from the Civil Rights Movement to the April 6th movement. When sensing injustice, youth will make a move. Schooling is the most significant institutional experience that all these youth have in common, and as Fred Mann notes, educators are some of the strongest influences on how students perceive their world. Thus, educators' actions concerning sexual and gender minority issues not only have the potential to create safe spaces for these students, but also to create an environment in which all are empowered to be inclusive of sexual and gender minority perspectives in society. Teachers and schools must use their influence to encourage community and encourage acceptance of all differences, rather than using this power to divide. If we can shift this generation's paradigms to ones of full sexual and gender minority acceptance and appreciation, the subsequent change on our society will be monumental.